Imagine a single name that can rattle arena boards in the 60s and steam up a drive-through window at dawn. Tim Horton did both. Before the red maple leaf crowned his coffee cups, he was the Maple Leafs' unbreakable spine, a blue-line juggernaut who could lift Jean Béliveau off the ice with one arm, then hammer a slapshot so heavy it made maskless goalies blink. Yet his journey starts far from bright lights. A two-room shack in subarctic Ontario, where winter froze the pipes and the Great Depression froze the future. From midnight pond skates on makeshift blades to 4 Stanley Cups, from curling railway ties in July to sketching donut shops on hotel napkins, Horton turned hard luck into harder hits, and brewed an empire along the way. Stick around as we lace up for the collisions, the coffee, and the crash that shook a nation. Because this isn't just the story behind your morning double-double. It's the pulse-pounding saga of the Iron Man who poured it. Miles Gilbert Horton opened his eyes in Cochrane, Ontario on January 12, 1930, in a 2-room railway cottage that shook whenever freight cars thundered past. His father, Aaron, kept locomotives breathing through 40 below midnights. His mother, Ethel, kept 4 people fed on scraps and optimism, turning potato peels into soup and hand-me-down flannel into stitched-up mittens. The boys on 6th Avenue owned store-bought toys. Tim owned chores, splitting stove wood until his knuckles chafed, thawing pump handles with kettle water before school, dragging coal buckets taller than his 6-year-old frame. Yet the first time he saw older kids cutting arcs across a moonlit pond, every muscle in his back forgot it was tired. A neighbor lent him skates 2 sizes too large, and he spent the night slip-walking on ankles, convinced balance was a puzzle a poor kid could solve with enough falls. Then, the railroad downsized. Aaron packed the family for Duparquet, Quebec, a mining outpost loud with dynamite and French slang. Tim's new rink was a tailings pond between ore piles, its ice the color of smokestack ash. Hockey vocabulary became bilingual before he could conjugate verbs in either language. Ethel kept his English school books dry by wrapping them in newspaper. But Tim's real education happened under mercury lamp glare, learning that a quick stick and quicker forearms translated in any dialect. 2 years later, another layoff sent them to Sudbury, Ontario, a nickel town with a smelter plume that painted snow gray by noon. Here, winter air carried a dare. Breathe deep if you think your lungs are tough enough. Tim breathed, shivered, grew. Sudbury already rostered a Miles Horton in its juvenile league, so the quiet newcomer defaulted to his middle name. Tim sounded brisk, practical, like the clap of puck on stick, and it spared coaches the confusion. By 13, he could leg press a wheelbarrow full of firewood. By 14, he was sneaking onto men's scrimmages and finding he liked the taste of their surprise. In school, he was polite to the point of invisibility, but rinks turned him incandescent. Spectators whispered about a boy who treated defense like a birthright, who stole the puck with wrists that looked sculpted from quarried granite. The Coppercliff Redmen, Sudbury's pride in the Northern Ontario Hockey Association, invited him at 16. Copper dust coated the rafters, the boards, even the sweat rolling down faces. But Tim's game shone clean. 10 goals and countless bruises in 20 appearances. He delivered open ice hits that popped like rifle reports, then gentled the puck onto a centerman's tape, as though it were spun glass. That contradiction, collision followed by finesse, nudged scribes to fill notebook margins with exclamation points, and Maple Leaf scout Bob Davidson underlined Horton's name so hard his pencil snapped. Soon came a train ticket south to Toronto's St. Michael's College School, hockey's finishing academy disguised as a Catholic boarding house. The major's dressing room smelled of melted snow, pine resin, and liniment. Crucifixes overlooked hook checks, and Latin homework butted against blue line diagrams. Tim thrived on the paradox. 6 goals, 21 points, and an OHA second All-Star selection headlined the stat sheet, but numbers couldn't capture his new reputation. The defenseman whose stare alone shaved 5 seconds off the opposition's decision-making. Coach Joe Primo told reporters, "The kid skates like he's late for mass, but hits like he doubts there's a hell." In 1949, Toronto inked his first professional contract, $2,700 and a handshake, and shipped him to the AHL's Pittsburgh Hornets. Duquesne Gardens was a sweatbox with splintering boards and stands perched so close you could smell a reporter's bourbon. It was also the crucible, separating prospects from lifers. Tim refused separation. His rookie season, he deadlifted a teammate during a locker room prank, then dead-stopped Rochester's top scorer at the blue line so abruptly the railings rattled. By 1951-52, he led all AHL defensemen with 31 points, fired outlet passes that traveled tape to tape like telegrams, and earned a first All-Star nod. Veteran winger Lou Jankowski joked that lining up against Horton felt like borrowing time from the bank. You knew interest would come roaring back. Toronto finally summoned him for keeps in autumn 1952. The NHL still ran on 6 teams, train travel, and grudges that fermented over years instead of trade deadlines. Horton's first full campaign was a 70-game gauntlet, 2 goals, 14 assists, 85 penalty minutes, and more closed-door praise from Coach Hapday than any rookie dared hope for. Todd Sloan swore he watched Horton halt a breakaway by palming the forward's shoulder and rowing him backward as though reversing a canoe. Gordie Howe, who inspired more fear than winter itself, later admitted, "If Tim had your number, you recalculated your route." By 1953-54, the league had no choice but to print his name in larger type. 7 goals, 24 helpers, 31 points. NHL second All-Star team. Yet the statistics annotated something grander. At 5'10" and 1,800, he looked ordinary until impact. Inside that frame, he packed a blacksmith's core. He benched 280 with casual boredom, curled teammates for bets, and spent summers stacking railway ties along Sudbury sidings, because the pay was decent and the ties didn't complain when he tossed them. On frozen nights, he transformed raw power into geometry, shading skating lanes, steering attackers into cul-de-sacs of their own panic. By the dawn of the 1960s, Toronto itself was transforming. Punch Imlach behind the bench, Johnny Bauer in the crease, Frank Mahovlich streaking up left wing, and Horton patrolling blue lines like a lighthouse made of sinew. The 1961-62 regular season saw him log 10 goals, 28 assists, and a plus rating most sports pages were too primitive to track. In April, he skated every second shift during the finals against Chicago, cross-checking Bobby Hull into irrelevance one shift, sliding a pinpoint pass to Red Kelly the next. When the Leafs clinched, hats rained from Brown's line to Scarborough. Horton peeled off his sweat-plastered sweater with the expression of a carpenter between nails. Job done. More work coming. Dynastic momentum rarely survives complacency, but Horton played as though the cup still owed him interest. In '63, he repeated the feat. In '64, he graduated to first All-Star status, adding extra heft to the cynic's realization that the Leafs' cornerstone was a defenseman as artistic as he was authoritarian. Legends accrued, true or embellished. The night in Montreal when he gripped Jean Béliveau one-handed and moved him out of a crease-side argument like furniture. The reputed deadlift of a Volkswagen Beetle as a post-practice stunt. The quiet habit of handing battered gloves to rink attendants with instructions. Give these to a kid who needs 'em. Through it all, he spoke softly, laughed rarely, and treated fame like a distracting rookie in need of a short leash. Each time reporters asked about individual accolades, he redirected them to penalty-killing percentages or the goaltender's shutout. Yet there was artistry in the way he merged instinct with mechanics. Tuck inside edge here, extend stick blade there, shoulder low enough to absorb impact, but high enough to intimidate. Opponents felt it in their rib cages. Teammates felt it as an invisible dome of confidence. Bobby Hull later reflected, "You knew if Tim was on the ice, the front of the net was closed for repairs." That sense of inevitability climaxed in the spring of 1964, when the Leafs chased their 3rd straight cup, and oxygen seemed scarcer than hope in enemy buildings. Horton played 80 playoff shifts without a single unforced turnover. Coaches tracked it, analysts marveled, punters drank to forget. Every clearing attempt found daylight. Every interception looked rehearsed. When the final horn blared and confetti snowed onto Maple Leaf Gardens, Horton skated a slow half lap, scanning stands packed floor to ceiling. Maybe he searched for his father, who had hitched south on overnight rails to witness the coronation. Maybe he memorized the tableau, suspecting dynasties age faster than men. The 1963 Stanley Cup defense began, as so many Toronto stories did back then, with a trip down the rails to the Montreal Forum and a promise from Punch Imlach that no one, least of all the defending champions, would be intimidated by red sweaters or by the 12 bronze plaques already hanging in the Forum's lobby. Midway through a February game, the Leafs were killing a penalty when tempers boiled over behind Jacques Plante's net. Linesmen Ron Wicks and George Hay couldn't separate the tangle fast enough, so Tim Horton did something no one had ever quite seen. He reached in with a single right arm, clamped it under the ribcage of 6'3" Jean Béliveau, and lifted the Canadiens' captain as if removing a paint can from a shelf. He set Béliveau down one skate length to the side, as though clearing counter space, then turned back to lecture a referee about an uncalled slash. One beat later, everyone seemed to realize they had witnessed physics rendered optional. Reporters embellished the distance from 1 foot to 3, but even veteran Canadians admitted later that some version of the miracle had occurred. Hagiography aside, Horton finished that year averaging almost 26 minutes a night, double shifting on penalty kills, logging power play blasts, and then sleeping in a train berth because the pre-charter Leafs traveled on Canadian national rolling stock that smelled of coal and wet wool. He earned a second straight second-team All-Star spot, mostly on the strength of that nightly workload, and the bruises he contracted translating it. The following season he leveled up from folklore to artillery, his lumber-shafted CCM stick, laminated but still one-piece ash, produced slapshots that appeared to climb after leaving the ice. Goalies swore they saw them rise like fighter jets. Gump Worsley, still maskless and still proud of it, eventually confessed that Horton made him reconsider the value of fiberglass. The blast was no accident. Every off day Horton spent at Maple Leaf Gardens' empty end zone, firing pucks at a rubber-scarred wall until the boards sounded like a snare drum. Coach Imlach finally banned the drill if Johnny Bower was nursing bruises, worried his 50-year-old goaltender would retire early just to escape target practice. When the league tallied awards that spring of 1964, Horton's name slid onto the first All-Star roster beside Doug Harvey, proof that muscle could coexist with orchestration. Toronto, down 3-2 against Detroit in the Cup final, watched Bob Baun break his ankle before scoring the Game 6 winner, but insiders whispered that Horton's clearing of Gordie Howe from the crease 3 shifts earlier had been the real pivot. By 1965-66, plus or minus had crept onto stat sheets, a cryptic algebra few fans understood. Horton finished the season at plus 30, topping most forwards, despite playing half the year wrapped in an elastic corset that hid 2 cracked ribs, courtesy of an elbow from Boston's Wayne Cashman. Painkillers were rationed back then. The trainer would slide 2 aspirin across the bench between periods, and Tim washed them down with sugary tap water, because no one had yet uttered the word electrolyte. He iced the ribs after games in the same metal tub used for beer on Saturday nights, then suited up next day with the fluid movements of a man whose body seemed exempt from cumulative damage. In quiet moments, he confided to roommate Alan Stanley that expectations were debts, and debts got paid, even if the ledger was his own cartilage. The older the Leafs grew, the more pundits wrote their obituaries. Canada's Centennial year of 1967 opened with front pages predicting the coronation of a younger, faster Montreal. Toronto's average age was nudging 34. Newspapers joked the dressing room needed oxygen tanks more than Gatorade. Horton, the unofficial dean at 37, pocketed those clippings. In the final, tied 1 game apiece, Game 3 at the Gardens tilted when Dave Keon shoveled a loose puck back to Horton at the right point. Everyone in the building expected a dump in. Instead, he unleashed that climbing slapshot, high glove, bar down behind Roger Vachon. The Garden's roof trembled. Over the final 14 minutes, Horton body-checked even Cournoyer twice, nudged Béliveau off balance in front of the crease, and knelt to block a Ralph Backstrom wrister with the same ribs that were barely healed a season earlier. When George Armstrong clinched the cup in Game 6 with an empty netter, Horton skated a casual victory lap, already calculating real estate margins for a Hamilton coffee shop he and Constable Ron Joyce had been sketching on napkins. Expansion had ballooned the league to 12 teams by 1968-69, theoretically diluting talent and giving 39-year-old legs a reprieve. Horton ignored the reprieve and posted a career-high 40 points. One Ottawa columnist coined "granite metronome" after watching him neutralize rookie Flyers winger Bill Flett 6 times in one period. Each contact perfectly timed, each exit pass perfectly flat. Horton shrugged at the phrase, wondering aloud if granite wore out tape faster than pine. He still bench-pressed railway ties at his Sudbury cottage in July. Still skated wind sprints alone when most veterans rested golf club calluses. Loyalty, however, collided with balance sheets on March 3, 1970. The Leafs needed prospects. The Rangers needed stability. Tim Horton needed neither, but obeyed the telephone. General Manager Jim Gregory phoned during lunch, apologized, and told Tim to report to Penn Station by Friday. Toronto switchboards jammed with fans lamenting the departure of their blue line patriarch. Horton drove to the airport, parked his station wagon in Long Term, and boarded an Air Canada flight that served ginger ale as weak consolation. In Manhattan, he paired with Brad Park, marveled at the Garden's velvet curtain sightlines, and played 78 games as if assimilation were a reflex. The Rangers loved him, but their accountant didn't. At season's end, they shipped him to Pittsburgh for a 9th-round pick that would never see NHL daylight. The Penguins were adolescents in every sense. Founded 3 seasons earlier, coached by the soft-spoken Red Kelly, filled with forwards who could skate faster than they could think. Horton offered classroom sessions at 30,000 feet, diagramming gap control on barf bags. In 44 games, he logged 2 goals, 9 assists, and a -5 that kept him up nights. Coach Kelly noticed the insomnia and called Punch Imlach, now managing the Buffalo Sabres. 3 days later, Horton cleared waivers and drove the I-79 to Buffalo, a city that hated Toronto almost as much as it adored borrowed glory. Western New York greeted him with car horns and homemade banners reading, "Welcome Timmy." He instantly steadied rookie blue liner Jim Schoenfeld, taught Gilbert Perreault the shorthand for initiating a controlled breakout, and introduced film night fines for players caught eating popcorn during defensive clips. In 1972-73, he played 69 games, posted 17 points, and wore his opponent's respect the way cheaper players wore elbow pads, scuffed but dependable. Every Wednesday morning, he carried a box of 40 Timbits into the dressing room. Within 10 minutes, only glazing crumbs and legends remained. Father Time finally hacked the scoreboard in 1973-74. During a December tilt against the Broad Street Bullies, Flyers winger Don Selesky rode Horton's stick into the glass, and his own elbow rebelled, fracturing Tim's lower jaw. Surgeons wired it shut. Swallowing became tubular, speech a gravel whisper. The league still had no injured reserve worth the name, so Horton masked the dull ache with Demerol, Tylenol No. 3, and stoic monotony. 6 assists in 55 games felt like penance more than production. But he refused Imlach's suggestion to rest, muttering that scratches didn't fit on his scorecard. Beyond the rink, his coffee empire bubbled. Since 1964, he and Ron Joyce had opened stores in Hamilton, Brantford, Guelph, Kitchener, weaving them along the 401 corridor like beads on a rosary. Horton handled optics, ribbon cuttings, handshake photos, weekend taste tests, where customers marveled that an NHL star poured their cream. He wanted Winnipeg Next, maybe Regina, a coast-to-coast caffeine railway to mirror the one his father once repaired. That blueprint dissolved after a Thursday night loss to Toronto on February 20th, 1974. The Sabres changed out of sweat-soaked jerseys and Maple Leaf Gardens, then convoyed to the Royal York for steak, beer, and Imlach's half-hearted pep talk. Horton, jaw throbbing beneath fresh sutures and furious over stalled contract talks, nursed whiskey, chased it with painkillers, and assured teammates he would see them at morning skate. Shortly after 2 a.m., he slipped behind the wheel of a cherry-red de Tomaso Pantera, Italian styling on a Detroit engine block, a gift from owners Seymour and Northrop Knox, and roared onto the Queen Elizabeth Way toward Buffalo. The sky was gunmetal, the pavement damp, the speedometer a dare. Near St. Catharines, the Pantera clipped the median, skidded 128 feet, vaulted an embankment, and barrel rolled until it disintegrated into carbon steel confetti. Tim was thrown clear, landed on frozen embankment scrub, and never regained consciousness. Police photographs showed a dashboard clock stopped at 2:31. The coroner's report showed .104 blood alcohol, codeine, and traces of marijuana. Newspapers called it complicated, a cautionary tale penned in gasoline. Teammates wept in stitched silence. Dave Keon spent that morning pacing his Toronto apartment, unable to fathom a league without the one man who had made opponents polite. The country mourned. Fans lined up outside, converted churches bearing Tim Horton signage, ordering double-doubles because speech felt frivolous. 4 daughters grasped a casket draped in maple leaf blue. Pallbearers included George Armstrong and Johnny Bower, both gray-templed and hollow-eyed. In the weeks that followed, Ron Joyce bought out Lori Horton's share of the chain for $1 million, promising to honor his partner's dream. He did. Tim Hortons grew to 35 stores by year's end, 300 by the next decade, thousands after that. Every cup carried the memory of a defenseman who protected creases first and morning routines forever after. Horton's skates are stilled, but superstition lingers. Modern defensemen still tie their inside shin pad first because Tim did. Goaltenders still wrap crossbars twice because he demanded they clear vision. Canadians still queue for coffee at dawn because he turned caffeine into a communal sacrament. Statistics record 1,445 games, 518 points, 4 Stanley Cups, and 1,614 penalty minutes. But numbers misplace the hum of forum boards when he slid a giant sideways. The concussion of a slapshot that made goalies flinch before contact. The mile-after-midnight howl of a V8 that no one got the chance to forgive.